Bonsoir et bienvenue dans l'ambassade de Hongrie. So much to the French tonight because everything is going to happen in English. Because as we said tonight, it will be an English event. I want to welcome everybody, and I'm very happy that you found the time to come to the Hungarian Embassy, because we have the possibility to have with us prominent politicians from Hungary, philosophers, and a very experienced journalist who is going to help us to organize the program tonight to talk about the Hungarian and French outlook on the future of Europe. My task tonight is very limited. I would just love to briefly introduce the panelists that are here tonight. And I will start with the moderator of this event, Ms. Hélène de Lauzun, who is a historian, who is a university lecturer. Her special field of interest is Central Europe, Austria and Hungary more specifically. She wrote several books on the history of Austria, also on the diplomatic relations between Austria and France, and she is editor and columnist of the European Conservative. So thank you very much for being the moderator tonight. The panelists are Mr. Balázs Orbán, who is not a family member of our Prime Minister. He's the political director of the Hungarian Prime Minister since 2021, which entails that he is the chief advisor who coordinates the work of the Prime Minister's advisors. He is the chairman of the board of the Matthias Corvinus Collegium, Hungary's leading extracurricular educational institution, and he chairs the advisory board of the National Public Service University. He was member and then director of research of the Századvég Foundation, a conservative think tank, and he wrote several books. Amongst them, the most recent one is The Hungarian Way of Strategy. And we are very honored to have with us Professor Rémi Brague, who is a historian of philosophy, author of many books. The best known among them in the English-speaking world is Europe, la vie romaine, translated into English as Eccentric Culture, a Theory of Western Civilization. He is a specialist of Middle Ages, dealing a lot with particular Islam, Jewish, and Christian thought of the period of this history, expert of the ancient Greek philosophy, committed to Catholicism, and he is Professor Emeritus of Arabic and Religious Philosophy at the Sorbonne and Chair of Philosophy Emeritus at the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich. Mr. Brague is the recipient of numerous awards, and he was named a Chevalier de l'Ordre National de la Légion d'Honneur. We are very happy to have you all here tonight, and we are all expecting a very interesting discussion, and therefore I pass the floor to Hélène. Thank you so much.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very honored to be there tonight to moderate this panel with two prestigious guests. I hope people, the background of the room can hear me. I'm going to try to speak as loud as possible. So we are here to discuss the thorny question of Hungarian and French outlook on the future of Europe. We're at a crossroad because 1 year ago, the French turning presidency of the European Union was about to end. It was about to end at the end of June. And nowadays, Hungary is preparing for its own presidency, turning presidency, which is planned for the second semester of 2024. And yesterday, I discovered on the social media on Justice Minister Judith Varga Facebook account that she wanted to warn of the fact the European Parliament wanted to vote perhaps on a resolution against Hungary, intended perhaps to prevent Hungary's EU presidency. So I don't know if it is a true and possible perspective, and is there a chance of such a resolution to be voted, which would be, of course, extremely serious? Is there nowadays, Mr. Orbán, a real design from the EU institution to prevent Hungary to play its full role among member European states?
Thank you very much for the question, and thanks very much for giving me an opportunity to to be part of this panel, and please apologize me because the language of the discussion is English because of me, obviously. So
it could be because of us, because we don't speak Hungarian.
yeah. Thank you. French diplomacy in progress. This is what you've seen. And thank you very much for the very heated question right now. You know, when I first heard this, I think it's serious. So this serious thing that the liberal, leftist, greenish majority of the European Parliament is planning to accept a resolution against Hungary in connection with the upcoming presidency of my country, and I'm pretty sure that they're gonna accept it because it's, you know, their obligation. That's what they are doing. They are accepting these kind of resolution on a daily basis. This is part of their job. They have the majority. Then when I heard this news, the first thing what came into my mind is that we have to be very thankful for them, because that's one more argument on our side against the idea of European Parliament. because we Hungarians see the European Parliament as it is operating right now with this over-politicized federalistic leftist view, not part of the solution if you talk about the future of the European integration, but part of the problem. And if you see that they are not afraid of accepting a resolution which goes obviously against the EU treaties, which has no legal background at all, which is about actually cancelling a member state which has done nothing wrong, then it shows clearly that the European integration led by the idea of European integration led by the European Parliament is a dead-end street. So we should open up all questions, and if you talk about the future of Europe, if you talk about the institutional reforms, we should open up discussions on the future of European institutions as well.
You published last year a book, The Hungarian Way of Strategy. It's been translated into English. I don't know if there is a translation in French that is planned for perhaps in the next month. In this book, you defend Hungary's specificities and political project that is openly conservative, and you assume Hungarian rich heritage in history. And of course, it is totally in contradiction with the so-called European values, common values, that are regularly put in the front by the president of the parliament or the commission or whatever. And nowadays, the European institutions consider that these common values are, in fact, a factor of exclusion. And do you think that there is a third path between progressivism and exclusion, and perhaps it would be the path that Hungary would follow? Is it possible?
Well, I think we Hungarians like to use the historical type of argumentations, and especially I think the case in connection with the European Union. If we try to understand what is going on our continent, we have to realize that people living here on this continent for like 10,000 years. And there were peaceful period of time, there were war period of times, there were more united period of times for Europe, less united period of times of Europe. But the experience, what we are having right now, which is the post-Second World War experience of, also experiment of the European integration, was never ever before. And we are in a political community, in the same political community, based on the shared values, based on the common economic interest, And right now we have 27 member states. Never ever in the history of Europe there was such a deep experiment and experience of political integration and trying to harmonize the different geopolitical interests of actually the entire continent. And I think if we see this European project from this historical perspective, it's obvious that it's getting more and more challenging to preserve, to maintain the achievements what we reached in the past decades. So it's not an automatization, not a business as usual thing that like the Greeks and the Greeks and the Swedish and the Hungarians and the French and the Portuguese are able to live and work together in the same political community, economic unity, and based on the same cultural backgrounds. Never ever in the history of European mankind such a thing was successful for like 70 years. So it's obvious that if you want to preserve this and support this and want to have a future of this, you have to be able to put more intellectual energy into thinking about it and into trying to bring together the different perspectives. And what we see right now in contemporary European politics is completely the opposite. That the Brussels bureaucracy, the federalists who are committed that they want to finish the ever-closing union project, they want to get rid of with the nation states and build a European super empire. They don't want to give more intellectual energy into bringing together the different perspectives of the nation. They want to finish the discussion. They want to turn it in a very short term into an empire which is operated from a center, and all the periphery is in direct commanded by the center. And I think it's not a good idea because exactly the opposite should be done. In this challenging times, we should be able to intellectually bring in more energy and try to understand what brings us and keeps us together. And I think the founding fathers of the European Union and those who were thinking about the contemporary European institutional structure, they were aware of this fact. But right now the European leaders and European Brusselian leadership, they seem to forget this basic fact and basic logic of European politics. And this makes us very sad. And we hope that as soon as it is possible, we will be able to get back to the good track where we've been.
We have here the panelists who is there to give us intellectual energy. So on the French perspective, Professor Brague, what do you think about the role Hungary can take place in the European game? Is it just a scratch in the back, or has it a key role in long term, perhaps to help tipping the balance in the good sense, in the good way?
Well, thank you for quite a good question, but I'm afraid I'm not that competent in that field. Well, as far as intellectual things are concerned, well, that's my hood. But apart from that, I would rather reflect not from the point of view of France, for there is no such a thing as a French outlook on the future of Europe. There is at least one outlook of a very particular Frenchman, i.e. my humble self. But as far as my field of competence is concerned, well, you mentioned intellectual pursuits. Well, I can feel relatively at home with that, as far as the question is, first of all, what does it mean to be European? We call some, political construction which plumes itself with the name of European Union. It plumes itself with the adjective European. And my question would be, what does it mean exactly in terms of values, in terms of common heritage, in terms of traditional doings and thinkings? What does it mean to be European? And I'm afraid the case of Hungary, which is trying at present, to the best of my knowledge, to get back to the original intuition of the so-called founding fathers of the European Union, borrowing Monet, who was rather an economist than a political thinker or a thinker at large. The original intuition was, first of all, the dream of a peaceful place on the surface of the earth, in contradistinction to other more violent places, and it's with the idea of sharing a common cultural heritage. And this is what I tried to bring out in the book you were as nice to mention, and which, by the way, exists in Hungarian. Oh, I'm very pleased to be able to mention that, because I owe that to an old friend of mine, Marot Miklos. Okay, but in my opinion, the problem might be perhaps more serious than what comes to the fore in the particular case of Hungary. The question is whether the Europeans are still really wanting to have a future. Well, a common future, to be sure, in the framework of the European Union or European Community, as it used to be called in former times, and other political constructions of this kind. The trouble is that I am not sure. Well, let me first confess that I am rather on the pessimistic side. That's nothing intellectual. That's something to do with my bodily fluids, according to Galenic medicine. I have a strong tendency to look at things through gray spectacles. Other people have rosy spectacles. This is, unfortunately, this is not the case as far as I'm concerned. But my question is whether we still want European mankind, the Hungarian being, and the French being only particular samples of this kind of mankind, of this cast of mind, or I hate the word mentality, which doesn't mean a great deal. There is something like European culture, and I wonder whether Europeans are still really ready to, not to be too bombastic, not necessarily to fight for it, but simply to keep on fostering it. This is the question that, sort of keeps me awake.
So, Mr. Robin, do you think that presently
and
European
the answer,
people...
Professor? Sorry.
The answer, the task of the philosopher is not to provide people with ready-made answers or with answers generally meaning. The task of the philosopher consists in endeavoring to describe the situation, in this particular case, the cultural situation of Europe. To be sure, as long as a European could share some ideas, I do not like the word values, but could share some principles, could share some points of reference, of cultural reference. Well, this could do, and regardless whether those principles were brought to the full light of consciousness, as long as they were there, as there were the underpinning, the Unterbau, to speak in Marxist parlance, as long as those underpinnings were there, people wanted to go on living. There is something I deeply admire in present-day Hungarian policies, what they do for the family. For it's the case that more often than not, our French and probably Brazilian politicians don't give a damn about those problems, which are the basis for if you want to have a history, well, you must have subjects, you must have people who will do this history. And again, to quote Marx, the very first basis of human history is the existence of human beings. And now, this is something that we are not allowed to take for granted any longer. For the problem is there. And, well, one good thing with which Hungary could contribute to the common treasure of European policies is precisely the family policy.
May I react on that? So, what if we try to understand what can bring together European people, because it's not easy, because I think Europe is based on different nations. I understand that some Western Europeans are saying that the concept of nation is a modern concept which was emerged only around the French Revolution, but I think it's not true. It's definitely not true in the case of Hungary, because the concept of nation emerged at least 1,100 years ago. And I think there are some other nations as well who see themselves as older than 200 something years. So it's definitely not easy to bring together these kind of nationhoods. If there is something which is able to bring together the European people, it has to come from Christianity, from religion, and not from a personal faith point of view, but from the principle or cultural background which comes through the Bible, and which is actually a uniting force for the entire continent. So that's why we take this serious, and that's why we are concerned that everybody who is operating in Brussels is denying the fact that the idea of Europe is somehow linked to the idea of Christianity, because if they are denying the fact that denying the only element which is able, and it's proven to be able to bring together the different European nations. So then we don't understand, if you throw this away, then what remains? And probably all our conflicts are because of that. And as it was said by the professor, the Christian way of thinking, it helps you to it's not about personal faith, it's about prioritizing in political decision making. And if you take it seriously, the Christian philosophy or theology or way of thinking, you have to be aware of the fact that there will be no future for the mankind without a man who is a father, and without a woman who is a mother, and without them making as many children as they are possible to make. And this is so simple. And this the basic fact is denied by many of the European political forces. And we try to transfer this principle and put this principle into an everyday political practice, change the whole landscape and environment in Hungary, try to support everybody who wants to get married and wants to have children, not being isolated by the society, but being the cornerstone of the society, being appreciated by the entire society, being supported by the government. And I have to say that it's a long fight. We are not there yet. We are not able to replace ourselves yet. But in just 10 years' time, the number of marriages doubled, number of divorces halved, the rate of abortion went down with 40% without changing any kind of regulation, and the fertility rate went up without immigration. So it's like I think it's possible, and the majority of the Europeans are still see things in a very similar way. So probably it's because of my age, but I am more optimistic than the professor.
Professor Brague, you're part of the One of Us committee.
I am. Mm-hmm.
And it's gathered to defend the human being and its dignity at a European level. Mm-hmm. And could you tell a bit more about this initiative, and which echo does it find among European deputies and officials? Are you regarded as strange beasts when you are speaking about these questions, or are they connected to very concrete matters, political matters such as family, immigration, etc.?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a great deal to be said, but just to answer your question without any cop-out, I guess that many politicians, many people who pull the strings not only in the state, but in society, agree with us. But whether they have the pluck to come clean on this point, I would doubt. For the pressure of the media is definitely against us, for reasons which would be interesting to discuss here, but that's not my point. No, my point is, well, let me first tell you, Herr Orban, that I couldn't agree more on what you told us about the part which should be played by Christianity. But let me add a rider. It is the case that for some people, Christianity boils down to a set of values, and they support, they defend, they fight for Christian values without their considering themselves as Christians. Well, I'm thinking of this Italian quite interesting politician Marcello Pera, who had this most interesting discussion with former Pope Benedict. He describes himself as a supporter of Christendom, but not as a Christian. It's the case, well, that's just to, that's an anecdote which could probably make you smile. Well, I'm the proud inventor of the French word, well, let me tell it in English, Christianist. A Christianist, in contradistinction to a Christian, is a person who believes in Christianity, whereas a Christian is a person who believes in Christ, who believes in Jesus of Nazareth as being the Messiah of Israel, and so on and so forth. Now, it's the case that the reference to Christian values, to Christian culture, to Christian civilization, or words of that ilk, well, won't produce any effect unless people really believe in Christ, i.e., trying to ground a political construction or whatever on values. That's a word which I hate, by the way. As soon as I hear value, I draw. The same as going with culture. Well, be that as it may.
It's part of the Orwellian language of the Europeans.
There's a great deal of newspeak rampant at present in Brussels and in other places, and the first step in cleaning our minds would be to do away with this newspeak. Okay, but let us let this aside. You mentioned the problems of a family policy. Well, that's excellent. We should do as you do in Hungary. Okay. But in order to reproduce themselves, rational living beings, well, Homo sapiens, as the idiom has it, has to have reasons. Animals need no reasons. They have the instinct, and that's okay. They have a period of heat, and okay. And they produce, and they lay eggs, and they do all kinds of things in order to reproduce the species. In our case, things are, in the case of human beings, things are a bit more complicated. We have to be in possession of good reasons. By the way, good reasons is almost a tautology, for a reason must be always good. If it's not good, that's not a reason, that's a cause. And we must have good reasons for us to go on with the human adventure, which, personally, I find rather interesting. I would like to know what will come when I have handed in my dinner pail, and I'm curious about that. But what kind of good reasons can we have? This presupposes a whole world view. And here we are back among intellectual pursuits. We must have a world view according to which having children is good, because the very existence of humankind on the surface of the earth is a good. And it's not that easy to show that to people who swallowed Schopenhauer, who swallowed Darwin, who swallowed a great deal of such thinkers according to which we should look at the world with the eyes very similar to the eyes of Gnostics, of people who in the 2nd and 3rd century of the Christian era looked at the world as being the production either of an incompetent bungler who botched things up, or of a cruel executioner who made a world to be sure beautiful, but so beautiful that we would like to stay there and not to get back to the super heavenly realm out of which we fell, out of which our souls fell. We are facing at present some sort of comeback of the Gnostic outlook, and perhaps it would be, apposite for us to counter it with Christianity.
At the moment, the French press is commenting extensively on Emmanuel Macron's latest statements on the de-civilization affecting France. So I think it's rather ironical to hear, of course, this word of de-civilization in his mouth, because I consider that he has made a lot to de-civilize things in our country. So what do you think he puts behind this word of de-civilization, and what advice would you like to give him in response?
Support the Hungarians further? I don't know. I think the key sentence was said by the professor, who made it very, very clear that it's not about saying things, it's about doing things. And if you take these principles seriously, or if you agree on these principles, agree on the challenges, agree on the dangers, then you have to act as an elected politicians, actively against them. I just couple weeks ago, I just came back from United States, and I was invited by the Heritage Foundation, which is the biggest and the wonderful and the very prestigious think tank, conservative right-wing think tank in the United States. They organized a big conference, the 50th anniversary, and they asked me to speak. And that was one point of the discussion. I was talking about education and what we are doing in Hungary to preserve freedom and to provide some value-based education, and how the rest of the world could probably deal with that. And then we started to talk about the family policy, and there was one point where I mentioned that we spend 6% of our GDP on family policy, which is 3 times higher than the 2% what we spend on military. And I think it's a very good, principle that you always have to spend 3 times more on your families than on your military. Which is not about that military is not important, but it's, the most important is the family, supporting the families. And, the whole audience was in shock. I know that, those people were Americans, so for them to say that not the military should be the most important part of the budget
is inconceivable.
It's something science fiction, but still you have to take it seriously. And even among the conservative circles, I do have the feeling that sometimes it's just about rhetoric and not about actually doing things. So in the French case, I also would encourage the French citizens, because it's not my job to give them advice who is the politician who should be elected and who is not, but they should look on the numbers, they should look on the exact figures, they should look on the budget, they should look on the decisions, and then they will know whether it's this rhetoric is taken seriously or not. If I may add one thing, because when I heard the professor's argumentation about the purpose of life, that we have to have a purpose of life, then I realized that we Hungarians have a purpose of life, and it's because although we are in the middle of Europe, we are culturally an island. And we came here to this basin 1,100 years ago, occupied the basin, and since then we live there. We know that there are wonderful places all over the world, but we are biased, and we think that the most beautiful place on earth, and we want to keep it, we want to preserve it, we want to bring security and prosperity for the generations. And according to our understanding, actually it's said by the Hungarian fundamental law that politics is about an alliance between the generation of the past, the generation of the future, and the generation of the contemporary living people. And the purpose of life is a purpose of our life, and why we want to win the elections and why we want to remain in power, because we want to create a better life for the next generation Hungarians who, according to our understanding, want to live in that exact territory, in that surrounding, want to preserve their unique language, their unique culture, their unique way of thinking, and it's good for God. So it's not against the will of God, but it's in line with the will of God. Mm-hmm. And I think if all the European countries are and the citizens of those countries are able to find this kind of purpose for them, then we should not open up our mind to the future of mankind, because, okay, we are part of the mankind, so we obviously have to think global, but I think the purpose of life will be found not globally, but locally. So this could be a good European way of thinking.
Do you want to add something on that point?
Well, let me first tell you a story. I guess the story is true, but I'll be checked by Edouard Husson. That's a story about Konrad Adenauer. In the early 50s, or perhaps in the late 40s, when he was in power in Germany, Germany was reconstructing, emerging from the rubble of the Second World War. And somebody, I don't remember who this was, told Adenauer, we should have the same kind of family policy as the French have had for years, since 36, as a matter of fact, encouraging natality and doing things like that. And Adenauer is said to have answered, Kinder kriegt man sowieso. We get kids anyway. People get kids anyway.
It's wrong.
Well, this was dead wrong. This was dead wrong. And this might be one of the reasons why German demography was and is still plummeting. Plummeting. You know? That's why they must try and import.
Such as Italian natality too. In Italy, it's the same thing.
Well, Adenauer was not in power in Italy, but there must have been analogous phenomena in Italy. We commonly think that having kids is something we can take for granted. And this is not the case. This might have been the case in former times, but at present, the very problem of reproduction entered the ken of human freedom, which is a good thing. We don't depend on instinct any longer. And for this reason, we must have, sorry for the repetition, we must have reasons. We must have good reasons, and i.e. This kind of outlook, of worldview, of Weltanschauung, since I mentioned already German things, for us to go on fostering living. And this is, by the way, quite a philosophical problem. And, well, those are deep waters, but I feel sort of at home. That's the question of being. Is being good or not? If the very fact of existence is bad, then let us escape as quickly as possible. If being is good, well, this will draw a great deal of consequences. And each nation, I totally agree, each nation will have to draw the consequences or to formulate the principles according to which life is good in its own way. You know, the French way will be probably different, or should be different from the Hungarian way and from the Burmese or Swedish or whatnot way. This is a task for each nation.
What is very important in what you are saying is the fact that we do not need only good reasons, but we need collective good reasons. Because nowadays, the problem with natality, with fatherhood or motherhood, is that it has become a pure personal choice. It's an experience among other postmodern experience. Well, let's have a child because it's nice, but it's not a collective reason. It's not considered to be something that we have to share with our fellow citizens. And so it's pure a matter of individualism. So there is a kind of contradiction because, of course, having a family is a social project and not only a personal choice.
But the trouble with individualism is that the very idea of an individuum is an abstraction. There is no such thing as human individuals. There are persons, and persons are beings which first can exist, can come to being because of a relationship between two other older human beings. I was given the opportunity to mention the name of Auguste Comte with one of my, with this gentleman there. And Auguste Comte, well, said a great deal of crap, But from time to time, he had his moments. He said, the individuum is an abstraction. Individuum is a purely logical concept. But there are no individuals in this room. There are only persons. Only persons with parents, with siblings, with kids. Anyway. And we think, and we do policies on the basis of this totally misguided and misleading abstraction. Individuals don't really exist. They can't beget themselves. They have to receive themselves not only from their parents, but from their forebears till the Big Bang. If we don't face this basic truth, we are doomed to failure.
And Professor, as it was mentioned by Oswald Spengler, what is the driving force of European civilization is the Faustian spirit,
Cast of mind.
and that is always looking for new and new challenges and wants to actually conquer the world. And what I see when I'm traveling all around the world is that at those places where there are no demographic declines, but the other way around, it's a demographic boom. In the educational system, what you see is many children, talented children, competing against each other and want to be better than their siblings, want to be better than their classmates, want to be better than their parents, and what I see when I'm traveling is that the Faustian spirit is among those where you have children and where demographic decline is not a problem because the number of children is producing a kind of optimism and hope and competition in a positive way, which was always the driving force for our civilization. And if you look around in our schools, I see that there is no such thing as competition anymore. It's a discussion about rights and about the balance between rights and obligations, and everybody feels him or herself secured because I will have a place because my parents had a place, so it doesn't matter how much how committed I am. I will not be in a world of insecurity, but I will be able to do my living. I will be able to survive. So why should I be Faustian in a positive way? That desperately looking for innovation, for creativity, for new ideas, for discovering the world, for being better than the previous generation, for providing better living conditions for the generations which are coming after me. So this is something which is very obvious if you travel around, and it should be very bothering for all Europeans.
And it's a pity, especially nowadays, where ecological matters are omnipresent in the debate, in the public debate, that we do not use this argument that natality, families are just an advantage to challenge these ecological matters, instead of thinking, well, just stop where we are and let's die and the planet would get better. We've got to consider that there is this competition, this Faustian spirit that you were mentioning. It can be an opportunity to challenge this.
Of course, it's not easy because we are a small nation, obviously not a big nation in Europe, and especially not if you see together the Western world. But that's why we try to open up the debate about the stage of the Western and the state of the Western civilization, that if you try to understand the basic figures, you see that in the demography, if you put together everybody in the Western world, you're talking about maximum 1 billion people. And if you talk about the rest of the world, you talk about 7 billion people. You talk about economic power, United States is still doing well, Europe is going down, but the West, compared to the rest, is a minority production. If you look on energy resources, which are always pillars of kind of a technological innovation, all the energy sources are outside Europe. Mm-hmm. So the only advantage what we have as a collective West, and it's mainly coming also from the United States, is the military. So this is the only field where we are still taking the lead. And first, it sounds to be a good thing, but if we think about it further, it's very scary, because if you are leading the world, but the only field where you remain the first is the military, it means that you will use this power to maintain your dominance, because nothing else left. And this anti-Western approach, this approach which goes against families, traditional values, economic prosperity, and finding a purpose in your life, it brings us into a situation where we will be the ones who are causing trouble all around the world, and turning upside down the entire world order. And it's I'm not saying it's going to happen, but I'm saying that there is a possibility of this kind of escalation, which are coming from the civilizational defaults of the European and the Western people. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And this is something which bothers us very much.
I think you've put your finger on a sore point, and this should compel us Europeans, Western Europeans, French or Hungarians or whatnot, to deepen our sense of responsibility. You said, and this I must agree, that Europe is a small part of the world population. But the brain is a very small part of the human body. And the trouble is that when the brain sends negative messages to the rest of the body, well, the body will simply die. And the trouble with Europe and with European thought is that it is this precise part of the world which used to send and is still sending negative messages to the rest of the world. Even people in the so-called third world who pretend and who claim to resist the domination of Western ideas can hardly take themselves seriously unless they ground their thought on byproducts of European thought. Some years ago, at the beginning of my teaching at the Sorbonne, I received a young man from the Iranian embassy, no tie. Oh, okay. Another fellow who had no tie. And he told me he wanted to write a doctoral thesis on Strauss. Well, it soon turned out that the difference between Claude Lévi-Strauss and Leo Strauss was not that clear for him. And well, of course, I said, well, just come again once.
Just because of the time.
Absolutely, absolutely. Old school tie. You know? And well, I spoke with an Iranian friend of mine who had to leave Iran after the revolution. What's the meaning of that? Why this interest in Leo Strauss? And the answer came, well, they sort of recycle Strauss's critique on modernity on behalf of their totally medieval, in a derogatory meaning of the word, worldview. For them, Leo Strauss would be a staunch supporter of Ayatollah Khomeini,
Of course.
because of his critique of modernity. So they sort of recycle the quite respectable way in which European intellectuals, well, look at their own tradition in a critical way. They recycle this self-critique in order to gain arguments against European domination, which is, and I unfortunately agree, more and more to be looked for on the military side exclusively. And this should compel us sort of to gain a deeper and a stronger consciousness of our intellectual responsibility.
For the last part of our debate, I would like to go back to geopolitics and to French-Hungarian relationships. In recent months, President Emmanuel Macron has tried, with what would I say, more than limited success, to provide a voice on the international stage, especially trying to maintain contact with Vladimir Putin's Russia, and urging Europeans not to follow blindly the US policy. This was much criticized in the French media, in the mainstream French media. How this attitude has been analyzed in Hungary? Has it been considered as a possible point of convergence with Prime Minister Orban to try to defend an alternative view on the conflict and on international relationships?
He was one of the many sane voices we heard in the last 1 year, and there is obviously a point where this is a point where we see that Hungarian friends could sign up for an strategic autonomy for European thinking in the foreign policy in connection with Russia and China and with the rest of the world, because we are very committed that the Hungarian foreign policy strategy in the upcoming years should be focusing on preserving the peace everywhere where it's possible. If it's not possible, then in our closest neighborhood, and create an economically mutually prosperous trade and cooperation for the rest of the world, with the rest of the world. So decoupling Cold War logic, geopolitical kind of confrontation, according to our understanding, it goes against the interest of entire Europe, but definitely goes against the interest of Hungary. So we are very happy to see that at least somebody is trying to, because we Hungarians, we are supported by vast majority of the Hungarian voters. We were re-elected 4 times with 2/3 majority. So so we are domestically in a very easy situation. So we are not brave. We just can say what we think is right because it's backed by the Hungarian people. But it's not so easy with other politicians because they are cornered or they are put under pressure by the Western media. Although Pope Francis is probably he's the only one who is on our side in that issue, which is not a bad company at all. But
that's funny because 2 months ago, Prime Minister Viktor Orban was in Paris to visit Emmanuel Macron, and I had to write a report of this visit for the European Conservative, and it was very hard to find some things in the French press.
Yes.
Because the French press has been extremely discreet on this visit, 1 or 2 lines, not more. And I had to find some information in the Hungarian press to know what had happened in Paris, because we could see the French media were a bit puzzled and didn't know what to do. Confused with this meeting, and we could see that there were points of convergence, but
true.
But the mainstream press wouldn't put that into.
French intellectuals and politicians are very good in definition, and President Macron used the definition when he visited Prime Minister Orban in Budapest. And he said during a press conference that we are political opponents but European partners. This is a definition and a description which is 100% acceptable for us Hungarians. So we try to work together on the important topics in geopolitics and about the future of Europe. We should have an independent voice. We should have a strategic autonomy. We should have a European foreign policy. We should have a European military strategy, and we should not sign up for any kind of confrontation and economic decoupling. This is the point where I also do see a kind of a convergence.
Just the last question before we close this discussion. Next spring are going to be held the European elections. So what is going to be the Hungarian way of strategy for these elections?
We try to survive until then. This is the first part of the strategy. And the second part of the strategy is that European conservative forces are currently divided. They split into 2 or 3 factions. It depends on how we see it. And this is something which is not good for the conservative thinking, the conservative political family, and for entire Europe. So we should find a solution for that. So Hungary would be, I'm not saying during the campaign, but definitely after the election, a big advocate of trying to formulate a bigger and a more united political group. And we will be big supporters of all the conservative forces who are running. We will have 2 elections before the European parliamentary one. One is Poland and the other one is Spain. Both elections are equally important, but as a Central European, I have to add that the Polish one is definitely the most important for us as well. And I hope that our friends who really did a very good job in Poland in the last 2 governmental terms, they will have the chance to continue and have the majority after the elections, because they deserve it. And it's not easy to bring together these people, because those political forces, because they are conservatives. Their compass is the national interest, which is different from the liberals. The liberals' compass is always the liberal universalistic values, which are exactly the same. It doesn't matter which nation you belong to, which part of the world you are. If you are a liberal, you have exactly same view actually on everything than another liberal who lives on the other part of the world. So for them it's very easy to cooperate internationally. Meanwhile, for us conservatives it's very hard, because our compass is the national interest, and obviously a national interest could be in confrontation with each other, and you have to be mature, and you have to be well prepared to find a compromise if you have this kind of confrontations. But we are optimistic. We are trying to do our best. And there is one thing I do know, that without French conservatives, this alliance cannot be successful. So it doesn't matter what kind of discussion we have, we need the French conservatives on board with us, because otherwise this whole project is going to be lost.
Professor Brague, a final word.
Well, perhaps my concept of what conservatism is all about, if you don't mind. Well, some years ago I had to undergo an operation. They had to remove a part of my bowels. After the operation, I met the surgeon who told me, well, I had to remove 30 centimeters of your bowels. I could have removed more, but I uphold a conservative view of surgery. Of course, I was surprised. What has this to do with conservatism? He told me, well, that's a word of art in surgery. You know, this means what is rotten must go. But what is not, even if it could get rotten, must remain there, must stay. And this is the definition of a sound conservative outlook on reality. What is rotten in political life, in the life of a country, must go. It must pitilessly be cut out. But what can still do its job may stay. And this is what most French people can hardly understand. You mentioned French conservative people. Few people in France dare, few people have the nerve, the cheek to call themselves conservatives. In Britain, you can be a perfectly respectable conservative. You are not blackballed out of a club. On the contrary. In France, we carefully avoid the very adjective conservative. Well, things have slightly improved at present. There's a journal which calls itself, which has accepted the moniker of conservative, le conservateur. But a swallow doesn't make a spring.
Thanks a lot. Thank to our panelists and thank to our audience. And I don't know if there is some time for one or two questions or if we stop there. So just tell me regarding the schedule, what is 10 minutes for perhaps for questions.
Well, I thank the Ambassador of Hungary and the Embassy for organizing this event. And I thank you, speakers and moderator, for giving us your time to be with us. It is certainly a very insightful discussion and useful and very opportune, because right now Germany and France are discussing, within inverted commas, behind the scenes in a working group about the future of Europe, and as well as about, of course, the changes in the institutions brought about by possible enlargement. And this is basically one aspect which I come from a very small state, Malta. I am the ambassador of Malta, which rubs us in the wrong shoulder, because the European Union now has changed, has enlarged. There are other big countries, there are small countries, and sometimes we don't like that there are groups. We understand the historical background about the German, Franco-German couple, etc. But sometimes there are these discussions which present a fait accompli to small states. We know that with enlargement, there has to be changes in the institutions. And we know that when there are changes in the institutions, small states tend to suffer most. And this is what I would like to say, quo vadis Europe. If we don't make the right balance in the future of Europe debate, we will have more and more countries. Of course, the overall assessment of our membership is positive, but we cannot afford to lose and continue to lose sovereignty. In the beginning, there was the mention of the European Parliament. It's not a competence of the European Parliament to sanction a member state from being in the Council or not. It's not, absolutely. But the way things go is that the European institutions gain and gain more power at the expense of national statehood. And I would like to put this on the discussion table for you, because definitely in the future, sometimes in the future, this will come up to us, this problem, and if we do not resolve it well, we will end up with having more countries showing discordance with the European flow of integration. Integration for some means deepening, but for other countries it means keep the balance right, because we cannot afford to lose our competence, our national competence. Thank you.
Remarks over there. There is a question over there.
I belong to the Fondation du Pont Neuf, partner of the European Conservative, and this foundation is committed to reviving conservative thinking in the French public debate, which, to be honest, is quite a challenge. And especially when Europeans are facing harsher economic conditions, which is currently the case. So there is a risk that people may focus exclusively on the cost of living, regardless of cultural values. Sorry for that word, Professor Brague. And on a political perspective, how could we address this issue and keep cultural fight at the forefront? And from a philosopher's point of view, do you think that poverty, that peña, could paradoxically trigger a kind of cultural or spiritual awakening in Europe? Thank you.
Well, it was a question for me. Well, we should fight poverty, but if a slight decrease in our standard of living could happen, this would compel us to not only to thrift, but perhaps to some reflection. You mentioned the Greek word for poverty, peña. You remember that in Plato's Symposium, peña is the mother of love, together with poros, affluency. And well, if a let's say bad economic conditions could trigger some thought among our would-be elites, this would be a good thing. But I'm not that sanguine. about this idea. I'm afraid poor people would have to pay for more poverty, and our elites would keep, outsoaring the shadows of our mortality.
It's okay. I think we can.
That's what I fear.
Yeah,
You're the pessimist is speaking.
So, from a politician point of view, and from the experience of the last 13 years, and with the example of Hungary, I can say that you have to be able to prove that you are successful with your own value system. Because if you are not able to prove that for ordinary citizens, they will go and find other alternatives. Because democracy is about also about economic success. So you have to have your own value system. The people are even those who, from an incentives, from an inside point of view, probably would go to another direction. They are ready to accept it. They are ready to follow it as a norm. They are ready to support it, ready to identify themselves with that kind of norm system. But you have to prove that it provides prosperity for a country. So if you create a system which is from a value point of view 100% okay, but it brings poverty and human suffering for a country, then you are doing something bad. So then it's not good. Then it's against the will of the God, if I may use harder terms. So this is something you have to be focusing at, and you have to be inclusive in a sense that if you are not able to strengthen middle class, then how would you be able to make a sustainable political system under a democratic regime? It's impossible. You have to have a more wider, a more broader, and a more prosperous middle class, because otherwise the whole effort of you is gone. And middle class people will have a conservative way of life. Men, women, married, children, have a job, work, travel, pay attention to culture, being able to reproduce national culture. So they are if you take conservative thinking seriously, you have to focus on middle class people. Mm-hmm. So and this is why this war and the horrible economic consequences of this war for Europe is not a joke. It has to be taken seriously, because it provides human suffering for lower middle class people because of energy issues. Energy prices are skyrocketing because of inflation, because of bad job opportunities, because of deindustrialization of Europe. Mm-hmm. So, and these things should be taken seriously. For all the conservative politicians who want to go into power and remain in power and want to be re-elected by the people. And to the ambassador's question, what we see is that there is an ongoing debate about cancelling the unanimous decision-making in European foreign policy. They are openly debating, and sometimes we hear the argumentation that this is the price of enlargement. So we don't think that this is true. We think that it's the interest of Europe to be able to integrate more and more people. Meanwhile, it's not an interest of Europe to cancel the sovereignty of an independent foreign policy for so small member states. This is not a good comparison. So we would be big advocates of enlargement. Meanwhile, we will, until there is a government, there's this government in Hungary, there will be no cancellation of unanimous foreign policy decision making on a European level. This is sure. This is, it's not negotiable, not part of the discussion at all. So we will stand on the side of Malta in connection with that. So they have to start bombing us or send tanks or whatever, but until this we will not change our minds on that issue. Our ancestors were fighting for sovereign foreign policy decision making for 1,000 years. We are not stupid to give it up just because it is required by some Brusselian politicians.
Thank you, Mr. Orban. Thank you, Professor Brague. Thank you to our audience for this very interesting discussion. And, well, I think we have perhaps a more informal time to discuss together. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Jó, egy picit. Be.
Snip